Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel. Tonight we will drift into a long, quiet story that begins on the docks of Southampton and sinks into the deep waters of history. It is the story of a ship people said even fate could not drown. Yet it vanished on a cold night, and from its wreckage a financial order seemed to rise that still shapes our world. We will ask what happened behind the curtains on Jekyll Island 2 years before the voyage ever sailed. We will ask who the men were who boarded a train with covered windows using false names to sketch the future of the dollar in silence. We will ask why J.P. Morgan canceled his personal booking only hours before departure, as if he stepped away from a door that was about to close forever. We will ask how 7 priceless paintings were removed from the royal suite at the last moment, as if someone already knew what the sea would take. We will ask what secret thread brought John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus onto this single journey together. We will ask how their deaths became, in this narrative, the key that opened public acceptance for a central bank they had resisted throughout their lives. We will ask whether the ship that struck the iceberg was truly Titanic, or whether it was her damaged sister Olympic, and what some call the largest maritime fraud in history. We will ask why the binoculars disappeared from the lookout posts that night, and why a mysterious fire smoldered in the coal bunkers a week before sailing. We will ask what Captain Smith did with the keys to the strong boxes before the water swallowed him, and why certain documents and valuables seemed to vanish into darkness. We will ask how, in this telling, powerful banking interests in London could profit from a tragedy the world mourned, as markets trembled and fortunes shifted. We will ask what connection is claimed between the sinking and the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, and why the story insists that Christmas night became a quiet turning point. We will ask how the dollar, in this interpretation, moved from the comfort of metal to the endless echo of debt in the months that followed. We will ask who paid rewards for silence to surviving crew members, and why some were sent far away, living under new names, as though the ocean was not the only place that could bury the truth. We will ask why official inquiries were narrowed, why certain technical details were muted, and why the question of brittle steel rivets still returns like a cold wind. We will ask whether the iceberg was a cruel accident, or a lure placed with care to trap the very men who opposed the new financial order. And we will hold this as the central idea of the tale, that this was a conspiracy written in gold and blood, and that the voyage never truly ended, because we ride its consequences whenever we hold a banknote. To understand the depth of this claim, we must slip into the backstage corridors of the American economy at the end of the 19th century. The United States was living through what was called the Gilded Age, a time of rapid growth and glittering wealth, but also a time of unstable banking and sudden collapse. In the year 1907, a brutal financial panic struck, remembered as the Panic of 1907. In this story, J.P. Morgan played the lone savior, gathering powerful bankers inside his private library and pushing them to inject liquidity to prevent the market from falling apart. That episode gave Morgan and his allies, including international banking interests connected to European power, a stronger argument to sell to government and public. They said America needed a central institution to manage the money supply, to calm the storms, and to stop the next panic before it began. Then comes the date presented as decisive, November of 1910, when a small group traveled in strict secrecy. They used aliases and boarded a private rail car heading to Jekyll Island in Georgia, where they could speak without witnesses and write without interruption. At the head of this group, in the common version of the Jekyll Island meeting, was Senator Nelson Aldrich, linked by family ties to John D. Rockefeller. With him were representatives tied to Morgan interests, to Kuhn Loeb, and to Paul Warburg, described here as a key bridge between American finance and European banking networks. They stayed 9 days in near total isolation, according to the narrative, shaping what would become the Federal Reserve System. This system, as described in the text you gave me, would place currency issuance and lending to government into a structure that critics feared could be dominated by private banking power. But public opinion, and many wealthy Americans outside that inner circle, feared Wall Street control over the nation's fate. And in this storyline, John Jacob Astor IV stands as one of the strongest obstacles, not only for his immense wealth, but for his influence and popular reach. Meanwhile, the White Star Line, tied in this account to Morgan's orbit, was racing to build 3 giant ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. They were meant to be queens of the sea, symbols of modern triumph, and floating palaces that would persuade the world to believe in unstoppable progress. Then, in 1911, Olympic collided with a British warship, suffering structural damage that became a financial disaster. In the version you provided, insurance disputes and repair costs created pressure so intense that it opened the door to a dark idea. The idea, attributed here to researchers who pushed the switch theory, claims that names and certain fittings were swapped between the damaged Olympic and the newer Titanic still being finished in Belfast. The goal in that telling was to sink the damaged ship under the name Titanic and collect insurance money, while keeping the newer vessel alive under a safer identity. But the narrative then sharpens into something even colder, saying the financial alliance saw a larger chance to achieve 2 goals at once. It claims the second goal was to invite key opponents of a central bank onto the maiden voyage, then remove them far from shore, far from courts, far from any clean trail. When departure day arrived, April 10th, 1912, the world spoke of an unsinkable ship. Yet the story points to strange signs like an insufficient number of lifeboats compared with the number of passengers, and a confidence that looked too much like carelessness. Captain Edward Smith, called the captain of the wealthy, had worked for years within the same elite passenger world, and this was said to be his final voyage before retirement. The text you gave me claims he received orders to sail at top speed, despite repeated iceberg warnings, as if schedule and spectacle mattered more than caution. In the final hours before the collision, Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss dined in first class, unaware of how close the night was to tearing open. And in the same telling, the man connected to ownership and power stepped away from the voyage, claiming illness and surviving by absence. The text also says that Morgan removed 7 extremely valuable paintings shortly before sailing, a detail used as a sign of foreknowledge. Then the collision came late on the night of April 14th, and the tragedy began to unfold like a script written in freezing water. Distress signals were sent, and rockets rose into the dark, but the nearby ship Californian did not respond according to the narrative. Suspicion deepens in the text by stating Californian was tied to the same financial orbit, and that it sat there with few passengers, as if prepared for a selective rescue. Then the human moments arrive, the moments that remain heartbreaking no matter what theory surrounds them. Astor refused to take a place ahead of women and children, and Guggenheim dressed in formal wear and chose to face the end with dignity rather than panic. In this story, the deaths of these men are framed as the end of serious resistance to a central banking plan. And when the survivors return to New York, the text claims that newspapers linked to powerful interests focused the public on heroism and grief, while deeper questions faded behind emotion. Months later, in 1913, legislative movement accelerated, and the path was cleared for the Federal Reserve Act. The narrative insists that what sank in the Atlantic was not only a ship, but an older financial order, and that what rose afterward was a new system that would guide the next century. It points to technical fragments and underwater clues, claiming that traces beneath paint and within wreck details suggested the name Olympic. It also says that small ignored facts, the steel quality, the warnings that were dismissed, the private meetings in London and New York, all seem to converge toward the same hidden center. When the ocean finally calmed above the wreck, the text says the second phase began, planned in secrecy between New York offices and London banking halls. Astor's death, it argues, removed the most powerful voice that could have funded opposition campaigns and slowed the central bank project. Official investigations ran in London and Washington, yet the story emphasizes that Morgan was not called to testify despite his influence, and that pressure kept certain doors closed. It cites authors who claim the sinking cleared human obstacles, leaving the financial system to shift into private hands behind the official name of the Federal Reserve. As the end of 1912 approached, the narrative claims banker-aligned media promoted the idea that only a strong central system could prevent future crises. It says they used the confusion after Titanic to shape public mood, turning uncertainty into consent and fear into a vote. Then comes the political timing the text highlights, the Christmas season of 1913, when many opponents were away with their families. On the night of December 23, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it, later expressing regret and various recollections according to this storyline. From there, the account connects the new system to the power to raise and lower interest rates, and it ties that power to later calamities like the Great Depression of 1929. It repeats the detail that lookouts said binoculars were missing or locked away, making early detection nearly impossible and adding another stone to the pile of doubt. The text then widens the lens, saying this was not only a maritime tragedy but a struggle for influence that preceded the First World War. It claims control of the American financial system was essential to financing coming conflicts, and that the central bank would become the machine that could lend money that did not exist, then collect it through taxes across generations. It adds that Morgan's bank became a major purchasing agent for Britain and France, earning enormous profits from wartime supply chains. And it argues that if Astor had lived with wealth rivaling national budgets, he might have financed alternatives or applied political pressure to limit American entanglement in Europe. The story then becomes darker in its interpretation, saying the sinking cleansed an older capitalist class with national instincts and replaced it with a financial technocracy loyal to a global order. It claims that behind public mourning, assets shifted hands, empires were absorbed, records disappeared, and a new architecture of debt took root beneath the language of stability. And so the narrative returns to its haunting refrain that Titanic was not the victim of ice alone. It was in this telling the victim of a mountain of greed, carefully arranged meetings, and decisions made far from the cold deck where ordinary people prayed for dawn. The story says J.P. Morgan himself died in March 1913, only months before the law took full effect, as if his task ended once control of money was secured. It says the keys of the financial empire passed to J.P. Morgan, Jr., who continued close coordination with major banking houses in London. In this narrative, the unspoken will of the elder Morgan was simple: control the money and you control the fate of humanity. That idea appeared, the text claims, when the new system began issuing bonds and expanding credit to feed the First World War machine. Every shell fired in Europe, the story whispers, became profit in ledgers far away because financing had become the real battlefield. The sinking of Titanic in this framing removed old chess pieces so a borderless system could take their place. The year 1914 arrives in the background like a distant drum, 1 year after the Federal Reserve Act and 2 years after the sinking. The text argues this timing reveals the full picture. Wars were coming that governments could not fund from their own vaults. And so, it says, the central bank became a tool to lend money that did not truly exist, money created against debt. The people would repay through taxes, not for one generation, but for many. The account insists Morgan's bank acted as a main agent for Britain and France, supplying weapons and goods, collecting immense profit. And it repeats the point that Astor, had he lived, might have been a competing force strong enough to slow or block parts of this path. Then the text introduces another layer, the idea that this was a purging of an older capitalist class with a national sense. It says a colder class replaced them, technicians of finance, loyal to a new global order. It claims European banking power, described as deeply experienced in managing central banks, helped shape policy through proxies. And it says the official story always tries to frame the disaster as nature defeating humanity, while the truth lives in accounts in private rooms. The text says White Star Line later collapsed and was merged, and that original building records were wiped away. It says this erasure mattered because records are the bones of history, and without bones, any face can be remade. Then the story returns to the ship itself, and to the coal bunkers where fire was said to have burned for days. It claims the fire weakened one side of the hull, making the impact more deadly, and it claims speed was pushed to burn through dangerous coal. The captain, it says, had no choice except the reckless pace, because slowing would reveal the fire and the risk. So the ship raced forward as if it was being driven not by caution, but by a schedule written in fear. It also claims large sums moved from Morgan-linked accounts to unknown Swiss accounts shortly before the disaster. In the interpretation given, these transfers are suggested as silence payments or preparations for those who would play key roles. After Isidor Straus died, the text claims his commercial empire was seized and broken in a way that weakened independent merchants. It says the legacy of Titanic is not only in the seabed, but in every pocket that pays interest to a central bank today. The story even opens a door to questions of private networks and loyalties. It says Captain Smith received honors connected to elite societies, and it asks whether loyalty to hidden structures outweighed loyalty to passengers. Then it points to a symbolic date, April 15th, later known in America as the tax filing deadline. The text suggests this became an annual reminder of the moment the grip tightened, not by accident, but by design. It describes the operation as cold, precise, measured in coin and calculation, with no room for chance. And it says the machine built on the wreck still turns, producing wealth from nothing for a small number of families. From there, the narrative brings in secret archives and hidden links between Titanic and the fall of old empires. It says certain European banking houses saw America as a fresh land to fold into a global system run from the old capitals. It mentions claims of letters, agents, and obstacles that needed to be removed before the end of 1912. It also mentions the story about Milton Hershey, the chocolate magnate said here to have received a warning that caused him to cancel and survive. Back in Belfast, where the ship was built, the text says whispers spread about a secret room deep in the hull. It claims only select engineers could access it, and that it might have held materials to accelerate sinking if the collision failed. It also introduces the idea of rare atmospheric conditions, a cold mirage effect that can distort perception at sea. In this telling, the route and date were chosen to make visibility deceptive, so the catastrophe would look like unavoidable fate. After the sinking, the text says banker-aligned newspapers flooded the world with stories of heroism and sacrifice. It calls this emotional distraction, meant to stop people from asking why Morgan was absent and why key opponents died. It says Astor's wealth was pulled into legal corridors after his death, and that control drifted toward banks tied to Morgan and Rockefeller interests. And it claims the sinking became a sacrifice that helped announce an American century ruled more by debt than by real production. Then it claims that once the Federal Reserve structure was in place, secrecy lifted on certain funding paths. It says banks in London linked to powerful families had extended loans to cover Olympic losses, and that these loans came with conditions tied to the great maneuver at sea. The text suggests the iceberg was not the only cause of the great wound in the hull. It suggests timed internal failures meant to overwhelm pumps and guarantee the end. It says many letters and correspondences from that era were destroyed, leaving only fragments and circumstantial trails. But it insists those fragments still form a single line. Titanic was not a victim of ice, but a victim of organized financial greed. Now we arrive at the picture the text paints of the present, more than a century later. It says the outcome of that night is the global monetary system we live inside, where power moved through stock screens and central bank halls. With Morgan dead in March 1913, the narrative says the empire continued through his son, and through deep coordination with London banking circles. It says the First World War proved the plan, because the new system could finance conflict at a scale no treasury could hold. It claims that in later salvage efforts, divers found open steel boxes, suggesting contents were removed before the ship fully disappeared. And it suggests this supports the idea that gold, bonds, or key documents were transferred away, leaving the ocean as a stage, not a vault. It argues the hidden government of finance later steered the Great Depression to destroy remaining independent banks. And it even claims leaked papers suggested detailed iceberg location maps existed, yet were withheld from the crew to ensure the collision. It says some shipyard workers later spoke of guarded nights, forced labor, and a rapid swapping of parts between Olympic and Titanic. It frames this as insurance fraud wrapped inside a political operation to reshape the global money system. The official story, it says, tries to keep the tragedy within a simple lesson about human pride and nature. But this narrative points instead to trading floors, private dinners, and silent signatures. The story continues by describing how investigations were quietly closed once the new financial order was secured. It says that scientific research at the wreck site was restricted for decades under the excuse of respect, while the real reason was fear of discovery. According to this telling, every delay helped the new system harden into permanence. With time, memories softened, witnesses aged, and the official narrative became the only one most people knew. The text claims that central banks around the world soon copied the same model. What began in the cold Atlantic spread into a global structure where nations no longer controlled their own money. It says independent industrial families lost influence one by one. Credit replaced production, and debt replaced sovereignty, quietly and efficiently. The narrative then speaks of later discoveries, when parts of the wreck were examined in detail. Some fragments, it says, showed mixed serial numbers that fueled suspicion and reopened old questions. It also speaks of rapid corrosion, faster than expected, as if something was helping the evidence disappear. Some researchers in this story suggest chemicals were used after discovery to accelerate decay. The tale returns again to the idea of silence as a tool. It says charity donations, foundations, and hospitals were used to cleanse reputations and buy historical forgetfulness. Meanwhile, the families said to benefit most left no signatures, no letters, no direct orders. They worked through intermediaries, through bankers, agents, and legal fog. The text emphasizes that power rarely appears in uniform or with banners. It appears in contracts, interest rates, and decisions made far from public view. It says Titanic marked the birth of financial globalization. From that moment on, currency became a leash, and debt became a language everyone was forced to speak. Those who question this version, the story notes, often face ridicule or professional isolation. Yet it insists that unanswered questions remain too numerous to ignore. It reminds the listener that early critics and investigative journalists died on the ship itself. Their absence, it claims, made doubt easier to dismiss. Later researchers tried to revive these questions using forensic analysis of photographs and blueprints. It pointed to window patterns and hull details that did not match official claims. But the text says publishing rights were quietly bought. Studies vanished into private collections instead of libraries. It argues that truth in the modern world is not destroyed by force. It is buried under paperwork, legal ownership, and distraction. The narrative then reflects on how easily humanity accepts simple explanations. An iceberg is easier to face than organized betrayal. It says the greatest success of the operation was psychological. People learned to fear chaos more than control, and stability more than freedom. As years passed, the Federal Reserve became untouchable, immune to full audits. It stood like a fortress of numbers, guarded by complexity. The story says this immunity itself is evidence of power. No institution without hidden authority survives untouched for generations. It then circles back to the passengers, ordinary people whose names faded quickly. They were not targets, only acceptable losses in a larger calculation. Their fear, their final moments, became noise that drowned out the sound of printing presses. While the ocean closed over them, ink dried on laws that reshaped the century. The narrative stresses that none of this required hatred. only indifference to human cost in pursuit of control. It says the ship was never meant to survive. It was meant to disappear cleanly, taking obstacles with it. What followed was presented as rescue, reform, and stability. But underneath, the system fed on crisis after crisis. The text claims this pattern repeated through wars, depressions, and collapses. Each disaster strengthened the same centers of financial power, and so the sinking becomes not an end, but a beginning. A quiet pivot point hidden beneath waves and memorials. Now the story slows, inviting the listener to reflect. It asks us to look at money in our hands and consider its origin. It asks whether systems built on secrecy can ever serve humanity, and whether tragedies remembered only as accidents lose their deeper lessons. As we rest with these thoughts, the ocean remains calm above the wreck, but below history waits, cold and unchanged. Now we reach the final calm moment of this long journey. The question is left with you, as softly as a fading echo. Was that night only a tragic mistake guided by chance and ice? Or was it a carefully measured act designed to change the world forever? And now, what do you think about the Titanic disaster? Was it the greatest financial conspiracy behind the birth of the Federal Reserve, or a maritime tragedy later reshaped by imagination? Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, so you can join us again as we uncover hidden paths of history and quiet truths beneath the surface. Thank you for listening. And thank you for staying with Sleeping Radio Channel.